What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from Zoom again, and this time we are here with Bill Wilson of Blackout Records. Great to be able to talk with you on here today. Thanks for coming on the show, man.
Oh, my pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you here. It's awesome to be able to talk Blackout Records with you, especially because Blackout Records has signed plenty of bands that I think play true to New York City hardcore and really New York City culture in general. One example right off the top of my head, Kill Your Idols. I mean, shout out to Paul and Gary and everybody from Kill Your Idols. Well, if you kind of starting off, what was your sort of gateway into like hardcore in a way? Were you like a metalhead first and then you kind of
Oh,
discovered
yeah.
hardcore later on?
So I grew up in Westchester with a small group of like little rascals, like everybody did as a Gen Xer, and we would spend our Saturdays, at first on bikes and then on in our cars, going to various record stores. And we were lucky enough to have a record store about a mile away from our little neighborhood. And so myself, Carl Picaro, who became the um, founding member of both Breakdown and Raw Deal, i.e., Killing Time, were like best friends growing up. And we would just go to this record store and, we would take the bus up what was called Central Park Avenue to Record World. And that's where we would buy our tickets for the Ronnie James Dio show in Long Island, and where we would get our tickets for like to go see like Dokken at the Javits Center,
Wow.
not Javits Center, the Byrne Arena
Oh,
in
wow.
Jersey, and we would take the bus as like high school freshmen in like 1984 out to Jersey to see these metal shows, and then kind of our parents would pick us up at Port Authority because Port Authority was such a welcoming location in those days. Um, but yeah, so it started out, originally, the first band I ever loved was Kiss. I saw them on the Paul Lynde Halloween special in 1974 as like a little kid. And of course, every 8-year old or whatever it is, 7-year old wants to be Gene Simmons after they see that. And with the fire and the explosion, it was like, whatever this is my shit. And that started me down the path of hard rock. So AC/DC, kind of Pink Floyd, all that stuff was huge at the time, right? And Zeppelin, and then new wave of British heavy metal came along, and Carl and I kind of got into that. The interesting thing about, I think, the way that we grew up in our little corner of Yonkers is that Deep Purple was more of an important influence on us than Sabbath was for a good many years. Like, it was very interesting. Like, I remember listening to like Burn and In Rock and Made in Japan way more than I listened to any of the Sabbath records when they were coming in, because that's also when Ozzy was in his transition phase, right? He had just left Sabbath. Sabbath had just released like Technical Ecstasy was the last record they released. So I faded from like that old sort of hard rock, and then the guy at the record store was like, "This new band, Metallica," and
Okay.
Carl picked up Metallica. And the first time I heard Metallica, I'm like, "What the fuck is this? It's all noise." And then I got it, and Metallica became it. And so then, the backs of the denim jackets were all the Seek and Destroy 12-inch cover, and then we started getting progressively into like Slayer, Possessed, like all of the bands that came afterwards. And then a big influence was Venom as well, um, because we were avidly reading Kerrang as our source of what was happening. And that happened for like and then Maiden as well, right? So it went from like Maiden and then segued into the heavier stuff probably in slightly the late 80s. In the it's sort of in the late early 80s. So probably like 83, 84, we started getting really into like the heavier stuff. And if it wasn't Celtic Frost, it was too light for us. We were like, you know. And then the guy at the record store again, who was kind of like the Pied Piper of all the misfits, the island of misfit toys in our area, gave was like, you should try this. And it was probably like 85. SOD record had come out a while, and we liked that kind of hybrid sound. We liked bands like Hyrax. We liked, DRI. We liked Suicidal, and not just because that's we thought Suicidal was a metal band, and then you really don't know what they are when you listen to the first record. And so that continuum basically led us to Agnostic Front and Black Flag and Dead Kennedys and all that stuff. And we kind of, everybody during their adolescence, especially during that time, kind of eschewed what they used to be for a whole new brand. So when I went to high school, when I was at the end of high school, I was like, metal. And there's pictures of me and Carl and Don from Breakdown in a graveyard doing our best, like, Possessed imitation. Oh yeah, Catholic school mullets, like terrible non-filled in mustaches and beards, construction boots, denim jackets, Venom pins all over the place. And I'm sure I had a goodie brush in my back pocket. And I know that behind one of the tombstones, we had like 48-ounce beers that we all, the little tiny beers that they used to make.
Yep.
We had those. But, it went from that into like a year and a half later, basically shaving my head bald and kind of being like, metal? What is that? It's like the big lie that everybody tells themselves, right? They pretend that they were born punk out of the womb.
Oh yeah, that's my favorite. I love meeting people who are like at Cannibal Corpse shows or like Behemoth shows, and they think like, oh yeah, this is who I've been all my life. It's like, kid, no, you weren't. You were listening to Linkin Park and My Chemical Romance like everybody in my generation was back in the day. Like, nobody is going to their first grade class in a Cannibal Corpse shirt.
Right. And it's like, don't tell me you were a 6-year-old dancing around to a friggin', you were a Peppa Pig kid.
Yeah.
Let's be serious. Like, you were Peppa Pig up until the time you were like in 3rd or 4th grade.
And you mentioned,
there's no way.
And you mentioned Possessed too. I heard Doc Coyle say this, where and he couldn't be more right. Possessed is the most patch band you'll ever see. Like, I've seen, I've gone to thousands of metal shows, always seen the denim vest. I've not seen one denim vest without a Possessed logo on it. And there's no way in hell that every single person wearing that has listened to Seven Churches back in the day.
Right. And it's like, I think I have multiple copies of that vinyl.
Yeah. So there you go.
And it's funny because you don't listen to it all the time, right?
No.
But you go back to it and you're like, fuck. Like, how many times will I go back to that first Destruction record? Not a whole shitload. Will I go back to early Overkill records? Maybe I'll dabble in that periodically. A band that I do go back to periodically, though, a band that I've never left was Motorhead.
Okay.
Like, Motorhead spanned they survived the punk apocalypse in my record collection.
Yeah.
But there was the other band that actually survived was the first 3 Twisted Sister records.
Okay.
So not Love Is for Suckers, because I disavow that it ever happened. It was like Cold Lake for Celtic Frost. It was like, no, what? What was that? No, they stopped at Morbid Tales. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
You'd be amazed on how many sides Twisted
Or
Sister has.
Megatherion,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Like I've always said that Twisted Sister, like that whole band and D. Snyder and everybody, like D. Snyder has like I think he has like I think he secretly has borderline personality thing and just and uses it to his advantage because when you see him do one thing, you see him do something completely different.
He's like, and he brought that band together. I mean, there's no doubt that those guys could play their fucking asses off because they were like the last vestige of that New York City club scene. And they were playing 4,000 shows or some ridiculous thing by the time they got signed. And, you know, like that was a great, like they were a great band to listen to, especially when they went to England. They put out that first record, the Under the Blade record on Secret, which was actually a punk rock label.
Mm-hmm.
It was like I forget who it was. Like there was like oi bands on that friggin' Secret Records, but they also put out Twisted Sister. Um, and but Under the Blade is one of my favorite records. It's heavy as fuck, and like I just love the fact that when people were kind of like, you know, testing them, because they look so outlandish, he's like, "Fuck you, we'll fucking fight you." Right? And it was this really interesting juxtaposition from kind of like the slightly glammy but off-putting glam, like weird, crazy shit that they had going on stage.
Well, Twisted Sister, I always thought was sort of like the bridge between what we would see from the glam scene and what we would see like from thrash. Because I think like there are like with the intensity of Twisted Sister, there's plenty of intense elements in that we've heard on Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning and even Killing Is My Business for Megadeth. But like I feel like the glam thing is always there. I feel like they're one of those bands that started off one way and morphed into something completely different. And I love bands that have that story. You look at like I remember I reference this band all the time because it's who I grew up with. But like My Chemical Romance was opening up for Every Time I
Yep.
Die and Misery Signals back in the day
Yeah.
before they became a whole scene of their own. You see how like Disturbed, their first tour was like opening for like Danzig and 6 Feet Under. So like there's all these like different ways that like they formed other, and I think Twisted Sister is a good example of that. But you led me into a question that I really wanted to ask you. Like I kind of wanted this to be almost like a big vocal point of this chat because as somebody who works at a hardcore label but has a gateway in metal, I never understood how hardcore fans back in the day, and I've talked with everybody about this from Roger Mara to Mike Scandato to every like hardcore musician. I've talked to John Campbell from Lamb of God about it, and like I never understood how a Sick of It All fan or an Agnostic Front fan, Cro-Mags, couldn't appreciate the intensity that we've seen in a Slayer or an Anthrax or a Testament or a Megadeth or Metallica. Like, they all have the same intense riffs, the same fuck you rebellious attitude. I never understood how, like, that there was such a division between that.
Because it depends on what point in your life you ask that question, right? Because AF, fundamentally, especially for the record that Pete Steele had a heavy hand in, was very much a crossover band, right? They fit in with your DRIs and and all the crossover bands. Like that ostensibly is a metal record, the Cause for Alarm record. Two of my friends actually had a fist fight about that, and also the Crumbsuckers, whether the Crumbsuckers were metal or hardcore. They literally had an actual fist fight on our way to Bleecker Bob's to talk about the Crumbsuckers and whether the Crumbsuckers were metal or hardcore.
Wow. You come from a pretty good society if that's leading if that's leading you to if that's leading to a great sense of animosity. I mean, I'm thankful that I live in that world. if you're getting it to
It's just like it's just weird. It's just like, but I mean, it was kind of hilarious. I'm like, you guys are fucking fighting about this? What kind of morons are you? Mm-hmm. And I mean, it stopped after like one or two like punches or whatever it is till we broke them up. But it was just kind of funny where they just got so frustrated in their 18-year-old them that they couldn't hold back for like doing the seventh grade shove.
Little did they know that
right.
little did they know that propane would form afterwards. So
right. Yeah, and of course, you as an adult, I can sit back and I can look and value all these things, right? And more genres, and I don't feel that I'm doing my genre a disservice. I don't feel that I'm quote unquote true to the scene. And there's a lot of that mentally built into hardcore where once you become part of the scene, you become very insular, especially New York hardcore, especially in those days. So it was like Kirk Hammett showed up to a matinee and people were mean to the fucking guy. Like, what are you guys doing? Like, what are you doing? And like, it didn't make any sense. Denny Loco got off like unscathed. Some people got off like because they wrote it, but also Denny Loco was in a band with notorious Billy Milano. He was an SOD. So he kind of got a pass from all because Billy used to be in the Psychos, a New York hardcore band first. And so it was like when you're an adolescent, you tribalize very quickly. And I think that's what it is. And hardcore kids are more tribal and insular and have to be sure that they're the most aggro in the room. And metal just may have a slightly different attitude where it's like, yes, it's more about the music. It's not necessarily always around the beatdown. And like, you know, there was a running joke with Killing Time towards the end when kind of like CB's was going through a lot of violence in like the early 90s. And Anthony from Killing Time would be like, hey, I played a brawl and Killing Time played.
That's a good
You
accomplishment
know,
to have under your
because
belt.
it turned into just kind of like, you know, and then in the 90s, that kind of took a step laterally because there was like a lot more suburban scenes. And then there was a lot of things where that's when like all the karate kicking shit happened, people not looking out for each other happened, like the crowd killer shit started happening. And that didn't exist up until like 1990. It just didn't exist. Like it was violent, but if somebody fell down and you accidentally stepped on their face, at least you would pick them up.
Yeah.
And because it was about getting your purging your demons, and hardcore then turned into something that was, you know, not to sound all PC or anything, but it turned into very toxic dude shit in a way that it wasn't before.
No, of course it is. Of course it is. And it's really funny that you mentioned that. And I'm kind of glad you've mentioned it too. I think it's toned down a little bit, but I could see why people have been turned. I remember talking to somebody. I'm not going to mention who, but like he was into the music. He loved, you know, he listened to every 7-inch and Split you could imagine. But he said he didn't go to hardcore shows because of how much of a sausage fest they were. Sometimes.
Oh, well, that's why I kind of departed from the scene for a little while. I mean, I was living in downtown Manhattan in 1992 during the indie rock explosion. You go to a CBGB's night show, that's when all the girls with the colored hair would come out.
Yeah.
You go to a show on, you go to one of the later era CB's matinees, and literally you might as well go see friggin', I don't know, weird naked dudes wrestling. And there were a lot of women in the scene earlier on, like most of them were taking pictures, some were dancing really hard, just as hard as the dudes were. And it was interesting when it was a smaller scene, but when it got to be bigger, a lot of the elements that made hardcore special were kind of like put it down to where it's kind of tamped down, and only the most kind of like visceral, aggressive pieces of it remained.
Yeah.
And if you went to a show at ABC No Rio, where Kill Your Idols started playing in New York, not CBGB's for the most part, um, that scene was very heavily integrated between male, female. It was very much not a dude fest.
Yeah, and it's gotten a
And
lot.
like,
Yeah. Oh, I was just
no, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, and it's also, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic, like the NAD, fantastic new age hardcore band that has a female vocalist, fantastic underground band. You got like a lot of so many cool new age punk and hardcore bands. Like out of the UK, you got Svalbard, who I just spoke to yesterday. They have a great hardcore influence. Code Orange has been killing it too in hardcore. Employed to Serve. It's been really impressive, and I forgot the name of the band. I think they were called. It's gonna bother me, and I'm probably gonna remember it when we log off of this chat. But they opened the Madball show. They were like a ska band, and they were absolutely incredible. Comment on this video if you know who they are, because I'm gonna lose sleep over not remembering who that band was. But it's gotten a lot more integrated. You look at the hardcore scene now; it's as diverse. Kind of circling back to what I said about Madball, it was like, again, a very very diverse show of all ages and all that.
And the thing is, I love bands like Madball. Like Hoya is a great friend of mine. I've known Freddie since he was a little kid. Um, and I love some of the records, the Empire record that they put out on Ferret, like they had friggin' so many fucking gems on so many of their records, like, and it was fun to see them. Like, I enjoyed myself. I mean, it's not like I didn't enjoy myself at some of these aggro shows. Sick of It All and Killing Time used to play hundreds of shows together. Sheer Terror is not exactly known for being fucking an emo band. So, like, you know, I put out some of these records that kind of set the stage for second and third generations of these bands. So if I have the originals and like I'm putting out the first Sheer Terror record again, I'm doing the Outburst reissue, and I'm doing Killing Time's second record, and I have their first appearance on vinyl with Where the Wild Things Are, like, and this sort of that first, 1988 to 1991 era of hardcore, which is what Where the Wild Things Are was a snapshot of. Like, I don't want to listen to a derivative band from 20 years later. And I also feel partially responsible for creating this sort of dude culture, because the the followings are there too,
It's all
right?
your fault, man.
But I was an angry young man. I have had a lot of therapy in between, so I'm not anywhere near as friggin', you know, angry as I used to be. And so, like, I look back at it with this historical perspective and adult eyes. But like back then, I was all like, "Let's go find some Nazis and fucking beat them up."
Exactly. Which we should still
And
do.
I would be with people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I can't cast aspersions at like the young Rams on the hill who are still fucking experiencing the fucking, whatever, you know, who are doing some of that stuff. Um, but I also know that for as much as I kind of like say it, it's very ironic for me to have put out a lot of those records that set the stage for a lot of the beatdowns that people got probably over the next 10 years.
Well, and I wanted to ask too, because like even going with the formation of Blackout Records, because it's been around since like '88, like since before I was born and whatnot. Not to age anybody, but like again, the having Kill Your Idols, having Dead Guy, having Outburst, as well as Killing Time, and so much more. And I correct me if I'm wrong. I think Terror was on Blackout for a period of time too.
Sheer terror, not
Oh,
not Scott.
okay,
Sheer terror.
Sheer Terror. Jamie Josta, yours is, ours is. Sheer, shout out to Sheer Terror. But like you've had all these different bands come and a lot of these artists are still very, very talented. The way that Paul has developed Black Anvil from Kill Your Idols and uh, went on and so forth. I mean, what was basically, I guess this is going to be a very broad question, but when you started Blackout Records, what were you looking for in the hardcore scene? Were you looking for a specific message or an image or just a sound?
There's two things. One is hardcore gets really boring really fast unless you participate in the scene in some way.
100%.
Right? For me, it's a culture of creation. It's not just a culture of music and consumption. And unlike metal, where like you have labels that produce and a lot of people just consume, right? Not so much anymore, but back in those days, it was you had like Megaforce who would do things, and you had the merch companies who would do stuff, and people would buy, right? And only a small facet of that community would really be participatory in the culture. And there was still kind of the idea where band is here, fans are here, right? And in hardcore, it was our stage is your stage. Like we are all kind of one in wallowing in our insanity, misery, trauma, whatever the hell we're doing, trying to resolve by being here on the Lower East Side on Sunday in a 115-degree freaking club. And some of us decided to start labels. Some of us decided to start bands. Some of us decided to take pictures. Some of us decided to start zines. Some did a hybrid of both. Some did graphic design, right? And it was this culture of creativity that was also surrounding the hardcore scene that was really interesting. And so my friends in Yonkers had started a band called Breakdown, who grew to some pretty popular, obviously, during that time. They were one of like the, cornerstone of this second/third generation bands. And Carl, Don, and Rich wrote some really, and Drago wrote some really interesting songs, and Jeff had that kind of robust voice to fill it out. And ultimately, by the time that first iteration of the group broke up in '88, they had started another band called Killing Time. Well, it was Raw Deal at the time. And they, Carl then, picked up the pieces of what was their version of Breakdown, and then they found a new vocalist. And I wanted to take a snapshot of like a yearbook almost of my scene at that time. And so I pooled some resources with my friend Jim Gibson, who was one of the junior employees at one of these record stores. And, we took money that we earned saving from our summer jobs and doing all this other shit. And we pressed a couple thousand copies, I think 2,000 copies of the first pressing of Where the Wild Things Are. And Anthony from Killing Time knew the guys in Outburst. I went to high school with Paul from Sheer Terror. To junior high with Paul from Sheer Terror, who is definitely one of the most unfriendly people in the world at that point in his life. And, we collected these bands that were a little bit different than the straight edge bands that were big at the time, because I kind of felt that like a lot of the straight edge bands were really just kind of like the lacrosse team rebranded.
That should be a t-shirt.
And like, I just didn't like the whole like, we have to dress exactly the same. We're all going to X up. If you're a drinker, you can't be part of this. If you're this, you can't be part of this.
Contradicts
if
a lot of what
you can't be part of this.
Yeah.
And it was almost like, oh, really? Like, you're going to paddle me and have me ask for another?
Yeah.
Like, what is this? Fucking like,
kind of
whatever
contradicts
it is,
what punk
one
was
of
all
the
about.
fraternities in Animal House.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of
Right.
it was contradicts what the whole purpose of hardcore and punk was.
Right. And so that's what I did. I brought my friends from New York City, who I had just met, with some older friends from Yonkers who were integrated into the scene already and had some pretty popular bands. And I said, basically, let's take a picture. And it was an audio picture, but it was a document of that very specific point in time in hardcore. And serendipitously, other people felt the same way. Because then we wound up selling about 15,000 just out of the back of our cars at shows from Rhode Island down to DC. And then all the retail stores started taking it. And then distributors started buying it. And Jim, who had like more grown up, weirder, more adult taste than I did, I wanted to stick with hardcore. And he went on and started a label called Noiseville. And, you know, he would get stuff played on the John Peel show in the UK and things like that. But it was all like CBGB's night bands that I wasn't ready for yet. Just things that were just too weird, right? He loved bands like Throbbing Grizzle. You know, he loved, you know, he had a band himself that was almost pure noise called The Unholy Swill. You know, and he put out his own records. And so he did his own thing, and we stayed in contact for years after that. But to make a long story short, really, I go back to the thesis of we wanted to create in the scene, and we wanted to create a document of who our friends were and what we saw as hardcore during that time.
And you led me perfectly and you led me perfectly into the final question. One, I think you succeeded with that because there are some labels that have a specific charm behind it where like it kind of gives it that vibe. Like for an example, Roadrunner, for example. I always, whenever I listen to Burn My Eyes by Machine Head or Ascendancy by Trivium, End of Heartache by Killswitch Engage, or even October Rust by Typo, there's sort of like a Roadrunner effect behind it. When I listen to anything by Cannibal Corpse or anything by Cannibal Corpse or Behemoth, like their earlier stuff or whatever, I get that Metal Blade feel behind it, and I get this feel with Blackout Records. I feel like it is like a hardcore label in a way, and we've seen it plenty of times. We've seen other labels in hardcore, but I think you do capture that image. Like I get, whenever I listen to Kill Your Idols, whenever I listen to Sheer Terror, I do get a Blackout Records sort of charm behind it. And you led me perfectly into the final question I wanted to ask you, and it's probably, again, the most broad, deep, or whatever. How would you define hardcore? Because I feel like it is just as much of an adjective as it is a noun. I feel like it's a place, it's a person, it's a thing. I feel like it could go all along. It's you can't find a single dictionary version of it. And nowadays, bands being labeled as hardcore: Code Orange, Loathe, Employed to Serve, Svalbard, Turnstile, like so.
Right. And you know, just to wax philosophical for a second, like all the new bands like Scowl and Turnstile don't sound anything like Youth of Today or Sick of It All.
Yeah.
There are elements that you hear perk up in there, but they're kind of crafting their own path and own subgenre, just in the same way that, you know, the emo, like screamo scene carved its way out of that in a very obtuse, weird way. I would say that, you know, it all fell from the tree. It all really fell from the tree of sort of outlaw rock and roll, right? It all fell from that kind of thing. It came from, and it came from saying fuck you to the norms. It came from the fact that we're going to do our own thing and we're going to build our own community. So it's sort of the DIY voice of disenfranchised suburban kids. Whereas hip hop is probably the voice of, and this is talking 80s, not talking now. Hip hop was the voice of sort of marginalized and sort of unheard people and disgruntled people and politically aware people in the late 80s as well, which is why the Beastie Boys, it came to existence because it was just anti.
Yeah.
and it was anti-expectations, it was anti-consumerism, um, and it was really probably one of the few by the kids for the kids type of genres that there is.
I feel like there's in the
And
culture.
musical style notwithstanding.
Yeah, I feel like the culture of hip hop and rap is very similar to the culture of hardcore. In fact, because I think both were voices for change, and both were voices of standing up, and maybe that's why I think if there's anything, and Roger Merritt touched upon this, the big distinguishing factor between hardcore and metal is the lyrical content. You're not going to have a hardcore band singing lyrics like what we hear in an Iron Maiden song. I think
Right.
there have been bands that have done it.
Maybe Run to the Hills,
Yeah, very.
because that was about societal, historical horror show.
Yeah,
But like, yeah, you're not going to hear anybody talking about, like with any, like nobody would write a lyric like Ron and James Dio in a hardcore band.
yeah. Mike's
There's no
yeah,
no
Inhuman.
tigers and seeing their
Yeah,
stripes, no like whatever it is,
yeah.
no
In,
talk,
yeah,
they're no matter how allegorical some of those songs may be, the lyrics in hardcore are straightforward. You fuck me over, that's it. Um, I'm lonely, I hate you, my fucking parents beat me. Um, there's a litany of things that hardcore lyrics are about, either subtly or overtly.
yeah.
And metal doesn't really touch on kind of like pulling your heart out of your chest and punching you in the face at
Yeah.
the same time.
And there have been variations. Like Inhuman wrote, I forgot what song it was, but Inhuman wrote a song about vampires for like one of their songs. So they kind of,
And AFI was kind of a spooky band,
yeah,
moving forward after a little bit. I mean, you can't chew the same cud over and over again.
mm,
Only a few bands can kind of do that. AC/DC and the Ramones come to mind,
yeah, of course,
right? But like, you can't really. There has to be some sort of growth because musicians get bored, and the fans are like, "Okay, I fucking get it."
yeah,
Unless you're always writing that catchy new three-chord hook.
of course. And I think with you really said it in a very fantastic way. If anything, I thought this was the most informative distinction between metal and hardcore in the end, because the way that hardcore, I feel like hardcore wrote songs at things. They wrote, the music was like, it wasn't just writing music because they enjoyed the music. It was almost like their weapon in a way. They wrote songs at people, at society, at wherever. Metal, they would sing songs that come from within. They would sing songs that, like, not to say that hardcore music is shallow by any means, because I'm not. I just feel like metal music went a little bit more metaphorical and a little bit more deeper at that time.
Oh, without question, because the hardcore thing was, I mean, the first hardcore record I ever got was "Damaged" by Black Flag. The motherfucker just keeps saying "damaged" over and over again, like he's fucking screaming in pain. That's what Rollins' vocals basically were on "Damaged One," at the end of side one of Black Flag "Damaged," and there's no ambiguity. You're not looking to interpret his lyrics in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people may get. Sheer Terror wrote an album called "Just Can't Hate Enough," and that song is actually supposed to be meant to be taken tongue in cheek, but some people have taken it literally.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can't control people's
So,
interpretations.
right, you can't control people's perceptions, right? And you know, again, that's like, again, subtle differences, but you know it when you see it.
Definitely, definitely. So,
Like first suicidal record, later era suicidal records, different kinds of sounds, different kinds of production, different kinds of like, might be always relatively consistent lyrics, but still a change. DRI definitely made that more more shifty thing. They weren't singing about wizards or anything, but they definitely had a change towards the more metal. Is Spike the same person? I don't know. I never met the dude, so I have no fucking idea.
Fair enough.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time and for such an awesome conversation on hardcore. These are like some of my favorite discussions to have when doing this podcast, so I appreciate it. Just with Blackout Records, anything else that you would like to promote in terms of new reissues or what else we could be expecting?
So we're doing the three Kill Your Idols records that we did in the late '90s. We're doing those reissues, and those are coming out at the end of the month. All the color variants are available at blackoutrecords.com. So if you sign up for our mailing list, or you follow us on Insta, which is Blackout NYHC, you'll get updated as to when all the stuff is dropping. And then after that is Long Island's own Crime in Stereo. We're reissuing, actually issuing for the first time their Explosives and the Will to Use Them album on vinyl. Then we have two more Sheer Terror records that are coming out, two more catalog reissues, and that'll complete the Sheer Terror catalog collection. And that should probably take us up to Christmas. Thank you, Pressing Plants, for being so late. And then, we'll see what's going on. We're kind of thinking about maybe some new bands. But I have a full-time job, so this keeps me occupado.
Story of my life.
In my with enough to do.
Yeah.
With the reissues, and if I keep doing reissues, I probably have like another 2 years worth of reissues I could do, and maybe build it up enough of a war chest to find one or two bands that I want to invest in.
Fair enough. If you need recommendations, I'm your guy.
Yeah, I mean, I am looking. It's weird, but yeah. Well, I'm semi-actively looking for new bands that have followings, that want to work, that will destroy their life the same way that I destroyed mine.
I think everybody has destroyed their life one way or another. That's it. This music pulls us apart and puts us back together into some other type of behemoth that can't be outmatched.
Right? Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's a part of you. And even if they chop you up into little pieces, it draws you back together again, and you become this sort of like weird homunculus when you're done with it, because you can't get it out of your system. Yeah. I thought I was done with it, and lo and behold,
nope,
I'm not.
Nope. You can maybe take somebody out of the scene, but you can't take the scene out of them. So
you can take the boy out of hardcore, but you can't take the hardcore out of the boy.
Yep. And everybody is a hardcore kid. I don't care if you're 90. You are a hardcore kid.
Yes. Much to my wife's chagrin.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Bill Wilson of Blackout Records. If you haven't checked out Killing Time yet, if you haven't checked out Kill Your Idols, if you haven't checked out Outburst, if you haven't checked out Dead Guy, you got to check out all of it. Check it out on Blackout Records. This is Alex from Heavy New York, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, man.